The airport buzzed with its usual chaos, a symphony of hurried footsteps, muffled announcements, and the occasional frustrated sighs of travelers. Among the sea of faces, a man stood out not because he was flashy or loud, but because of his quiet, commanding presence. His tailored suit, well-worn leather briefcase, and calm demeanor painted a picture of someone who had clearly seen and achieved much in life. Yet none of that mattered to the officer standing before him. The officer's gaze was sharp, almost accusatory, as he scanned the man's passport and ticket. He was tall and stocky, with a voice that carried authority maybe a little too much. He wasn't just doing his job, he was making a point. "What brings you here?" the officer asked, his tone cold and deliberate. "I'm here on business," the man replied, his voice measured but polite. He didn't flinch, didn't react to the underlying hostility in the officer's words. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Business, huh? What kind of business? Seems like a nice suit for someone who need to explain themselves." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Others in the line shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to notice, but the exchange was hard to ignore. A few passengers shot quick glances, while others kept their eyes glued to the floor, hoping the tension wouldn't spill over to them. The man didn't let the comment rattle him. "It's an important meeting," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. His composure only seemed to aggravate the officer further. "Important enough to skip the rules?" The officer pressed, stepping closer, his posture rigid. "People like you think you can walk in and out without question, but that's not how this works." A flicker of something passed over the man's face, disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. He sighed softly but said nothing. The silence seemed to egg the officer on. "Open your bag," the officer demanded, louder this time. The nearby passengers went still, their curiosity piqued. The man unzipped his briefcase, revealing neatly organized folders and a slim laptop. The officer rifled through the papers, pausing occasionally to smirk or shake his head, as if looking for something to justify his suspicions. "What's this?" the officer asked, pulling out a document and holding it up like it was evidence in a crime. "That's confidential," the man replied, his voice steady. "I'd appreciate it if you handled it with care." "Confidential?" the officer scoffed. "Sounds suspicious to me. Maybe we should take this to another room." The man glanced around. The crowd was growing, whispers spreading like wildfire. He met the officer's gaze, his eyes unwavering. "Is that really necessary?" The officer crossed his arms. "Do I look like I'm joking?" For a moment, the air between them felt electric, charged with tension. Then, something shifted. A uniformed supervisor approached, his expression a mix of confusion and urgency. He leaned in to whisper something in the officer's ear. At first, the officer's face was unreadable, but as the words sank in, his expression shifted from irritation to surprise, and then to something resembling fear. He looked at the man standing before him as if seeing him for the first time. The officer cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of himself. "I apologize for the inconvenience," he stammered, stepping back. "You're free to go." The man didn't respond immediately. He simply adjusted his briefcase and nodded, his composure unshaken. But as he walked away, the officer stood frozen, his mind reeling from what he had just learned. What had the supervisor whispered? Who was this man, really? And why had the officer's arrogance crumbled in an instant? The questions lingered in the air as the man disappeared into the crowd, leaving everyone, including the officer, wondering about the story behind the enigma. The officer stood there, still clutching the man's document, his mind racing. He glanced at his supervisor, hoping for some kind of clarification. But the older man had already turned away, muttering something about making sure this never happened again. The officer's hands trembled slightly as he placed the paper back in the man's briefcase, his earlier confidence now replaced with unease. Who was that man? He looked ordinary enough, no entourage, no flashy displays of wealth. But there was something about the way he carried himself, the calm in his eyes, that now felt significant. The officer's gut churned with regret, his earlier bravado now feeling like a glaring mistake. He watched as the man strode toward the boarding gate, moving with purpose but not haste. The officer wanted to follow, to apologize again, or maybe just to figure out what he had missed. But he knew better than to draw more attention to himself. Whatever had just happened, it was clear he had overstepped, and now he was left to pick apart the pieces of his own misjudgment. Behind the counter, his colleagues exchanged uneasy glances. "What was that all about?" one of them whispered. "I don't know," another replied. "But did you see the look on the supervisor's face? Whoever that guy is, he's not someone you mess with." The officer could hear them, of course. Their words only deepened the pit forming in his stomach. He busied himself with tidying the counter, pretending not to care, but his mind wouldn't let it go. The encounter played over and over, every detail now magnified. Why had he been so quick to judge? Why had he felt the need to push, to provoke? A memory surfaced, uninvited, a conversation from years ago, back when he was still new to the job. "You have to trust your instincts," an older officer had told him. "Sometimes you can just tell when someone's hiding something." That advice had stuck with him, maybe too well. He had prided himself on being able to read people, to sniff out lies and inconsistencies. But now he wondered if his instincts had been clouded by something else entirely. He replayed the man's words, his calm demeanor, the way he had handled the officer's aggression without so much as raising his voice. There had been no anger, no defensiveness, just a quiet confidence that now felt intimidating in hindsight. As the officer mulled this over, the man reached his gate. He handed his boarding pass to the attendant, who scanned it with a polite smile. "Have a pleasant flight, sir," she said, her tone warm. "Thank you," the man replied, his voice as steady as it had been throughout the ordeal. He walked down the jet bridge, his footsteps echoing faintly in the enclosed space. Inside the plane, the cabin crew greeted him with the kind of deference usually reserved for celebrities or high-ranking officials. The flight attendant nearest the door straightened slightly, her smile widening when she saw him. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said. "Your seat is ready. Let us know if you need anything at all." "Thank you," the man said again, his tone polite but unassuming. He moved to his seat first class, of course, and settled in, his briefcase placed carefully under the seat in front of him. As the plane began to board, a few passengers noticed him. Some whispered quietly to each other, their eyes darting toward him with a mix of curiosity and recognition. But the man paid them no mind. He opened a book, its leather cover worn from years of use, and began to read. Back at the security checkpoint, the officer couldn't shake his unease. He had dealt with thousands of passengers in his career, but this was different. Something about the encounter gnawed at him, refusing to be ignored. He turned to his supervisor, who was now speaking quietly with another senior staff member. "Sir," the officer began hesitantly, "can I ask who was that man?" The supervisor turned to him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though he might ignore the question entirely. But then he sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Let's just say he's someone you don't want to be on the wrong side of," he said. "That's not an answer." The officer pressed, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic. The supervisor studied him for a moment before leaning in. "That man has connections, powerful ones. He's involved in things far above our pay grade. And he's respected, not just here, but globally. You're lucky he didn't make a complaint." The officer blinked, his mouth suddenly dry. "But what does he do?" The supervisor shook his head. "It's not my place to say. Just know this: he's earned his position. And you do well to remember that not everyone who walks through here fits into the boxes you expect." With that, the supervisor walked away, leaving the officer to stew in his thoughts. He glanced at the long line of passengers waiting to go through security, each one a potential story he would likely never know. And yet, he couldn't stop thinking about the man with the briefcase, the one he had tried to humiliate without understanding who he truly was. As the plane taxied down the runway, the man closed his book, staring out the window as the city below began to shrink into the distance. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket, a reminder of the meeting waiting for him on the other side of the flight. He didn't check it right away. Instead, he let his thoughts drift, the officer's words replaying in his mind. It wasn't the first time he had faced such treatment, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But this time, something felt different. The flight attendant approached, offering him a drink. He accepted it with a nod, his expression unreadable. Whatever awaited him at his destination, he was ready. The officer, however, would spend the rest of his shift and perhaps longer wondering what kind of man he had just crossed paths with. The flight was smooth, the hum of the engine steady and soothing, but the man wasn't focused on the calm around him. His mind was elsewhere, locked on the conversations that awaited him. His reputation had often preceded him, opening doors that many thought impossible to access. Today would be no different, though the weight of this particular meeting was heavier than usual. He adjusted his tie absent-mindedly, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon outside the window. Below, the patchwork of cities and fields blurred together, and with it, the moments of his life that had led him here. He had learned early on to navigate the delicate balance of power and perception, to recognize when silence could speak louder than words. Yet, the officer's hostility lingered in his mind not as anger, but as a reminder of the assumptions that came with his appearance. The plane landed smoothly, and as passengers began gathering their belongings, the man remained seated, waiting patiently until the crowd thinned. The flight attendant, ever attentive, appeared at his side. "Your driver is waiting for you at the terminal, sir," she said with a warm smile. "Thank you," he replied, standing and retrieving his briefcase. The tension that had surrounded him earlier seemed to dissipate, replaced by his usual air of composure. He stepped off the plane and into the terminal, where a suited man holding a discreet sign waited. "Welcome back, sir," the driver said, taking the briefcase from him. "The car is just outside." The man nodded, following without a word. The airport, like all others, was a swirl of hurried travelers, but they parted naturally as he walked through, as if sensing an unspoken presence about him. He didn't seek attention, but it found him nonetheless. The car was sleek and unmarked, its tinted windows shielding the conversations that would take place within. Once inside, the driver handed him a tablet. "Your contact sent over the final details," the driver said. "You're expected within the hour." The man scanned the document on the screen, his expression impassive. The names, figures, and coordinates all aligned with what he had been preparing for. The stakes were as high as he anticipated, but he had never been one to shy away from risk. As the car sped through the city, weaving past towering skyscrapers and bustling markets, the officer back at the airport found himself unable to let the encounter go. He had spent the last few hours combing through various files and databases, trying to piece together even a fragment of who the man might be. His access was limited. Classified information stayed locked behind levels of clearance he didn't possess, but what little he did find only deepened the mystery. There were whispers in the system, vague mentions of high-level negotiations and influential figures tied to global events. The man's name didn't appear directly, but there were traces of his involvement, like fingerprints left behind on carefully curated documents. It was as though he operated in the shadows, steering outcomes without ever stepping into the spotlight. The officer's hands clenched into fists. He wasn't used to feeling this powerless, this insignificant. He thought back to the man's calm expression, the way he had met every accusation with quiet dignity. That composure had rattled him then, and it unsettled him even more now. Meanwhile, the car pulled into an underground garage, the hum of the city above fading into silence. The man stepped out, greeted immediately by a small team waiting for him. They spoke in low voices, their words clipped and efficient. "Everything is in place," one of them said, handing him a folder. He opened it, scanning the contents quickly. Maps, charts, and coded messages filled the pages, each detail meticulously prepared. He nodded, closing the folder and tucking it under his arm. The team led him to a secure elevator, the doors closing with a soft hiss. As the elevator descended, the air seemed to grow heavier. Everyone around him was on edge, but he remained unshaken, his focus razor sharp. When the doors opened, they revealed a conference room unlike any other, a blend of old-world elegance and cutting-edge technology. Massive screens lined the walls, displaying live feeds from locations around the globe. At the center of the room was a long table, where several individuals waited, their faces a mix of determination and apprehension. He entered without hesitation, his presence commanding immediate attention. Conversations hushed, and all eyes turned to him. He set his briefcase on the table and took a seat, his movements deliberate and precise. "We've been waiting for you," one of them said, their voice tinged with relief. "Good," he replied simply, opening the briefcase and pulling out the document the officer had earlier scrutinized. "Let's begin." Back at the airport, the officer sat in the break room, staring at his coffee, now cold and untouched. He had tried to distract himself, to focus on other passengers and routine tasks, but the day's events clung to him like a shadow. He didn't know if he'd ever see the man again, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed paths with someone who held the kind of power he couldn't even comprehend. And somewhere, far beneath the city streets, the man leaned forward, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "The window of opportunity is narrow," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "But if we act now, we can change the course of what's coming." Every word hung in the air, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken implications. The people around the table nodded, their focus locked on him. They knew what was at stake, but none of them understood it as deeply as he did. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the anticipation of what was to come. As the man spoke, laying out his plan with precision and clarity, it became clear that everything hinged on what happened next. The pieces were in motion, and the outcome would be nothing short of monumental. But for now, the resolution remained just out of reach, the final moments suspended in a delicate balance. The room fell silent after the man finished speaking, the weight of his words sinking in. Each person at the table exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of determination and unease. This wasn't a plan that allowed for errors. Every detail had to be executed with precision, and every person in the room carried a responsibility that could alter the outcome. One of the younger members of the group hesitated before speaking. "What if we're wrong? What if the data is incomplete, or we've overlooked something?" His voice wavered slightly, betraying the doubt he was trying to suppress. The man turned his calm gaze toward him. "We're not wrong," he said firmly. His tone wasn't dismissive, but it left no room for argument. "Every variable has been accounted for. What we face isn't a question of accuracy, it's a test of resolve." The younger man nodded, though his uncertainty lingered. Others in the room seemed emboldened by the man's confidence, leaning forward as they began discussing the finer points of execution. For a moment, the atmosphere shifted, the room humming with the energy of preparation. But then, a quiet buzz interrupted the conversation. A phone, sitting in the center of the table, vibrated with an incoming call. Everyone paused, their eyes darting to the device. It wasn't supposed to happen, not here, not now. The man reached for the phone, his movements deliberate. The number displayed on the screen was unlisted, but he didn't hesitate before answering. "Yes?" he said, his voice steady. The room waited, holding its collective breath as they watched his expression. At first, his face remained impassive, but as the voice on the other end spoke, a flicker of something passed through his eyes, an emotion so brief it was impossible to name. "When?" he asked, his tone sharper now. The voice continued, giving him details that caused a subtle tightening of his jaw. "Understood," he said finally, ending the call. He placed the phone back on the table and looked at the group. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice low but urgent. The room tensed immediately. What kind of problem? Someone asked. There's been a breach, he replied. Someone outside this room has intercepted parts of the plan. The words sent a ripple of unease through the group. This wasn't just an operational setback, it was a potential disaster. The stakes were already high, but now the situation had become even more precarious. How is that possible? One of them asked, their voice edged with panic. It doesn't matter how, the man said, cutting them off. What matters is containing the damage. If they know what we're planning, they'll move to counter it. Another member of the group leaned forward, their expression grim. Do we know who it is? The man paused, considering his response. Not yet, he admitted. But we have reason to believe it's someone with access to high-level intelligence. This isn't a random leak, it's calculated. As the group absorbed this new information, the tension in the room thickened. The plan they had worked so meticulously to create was now at risk of unraveling, and with it, everything they hoped to achieve. Back at the airport, the officer sat at his desk, scrolling through news articles on his phone. He wasn't supposed to be on his device during his shift, but he couldn't resist searching for anything related to the mysterious man he had encountered. His curiosity had morphed into an obsession, and he needed answers. As he read through vague reports and speculation, one headline caught his attention: International Crisis Averted by High-Level Negotiations. He clicked on it, his heart pounding. The article was sparse on details, but it mentioned unnamed figures working behind the scenes to resolve a conflict that could have escalated into global chaos. The officer frowned, his instincts telling him this wasn't a coincidence. The timing, the description of the individuals involved, it all pointed to the man he had confronted. But what role had he played? And why had he chosen to keep such a low profile? Just as the officer began piecing things together, a loud commotion erupted near the security checkpoint. He snapped his head up, his training kicking in immediately. Passengers were shouting, and officers were rushing toward the source of the disturbance. He hurried to join them, pushing through the crowd. When he reached the scene, he saw a man being restrained, his face flushed with anger. In his hand was a device, a small, unassuming USB drive. What's going on here? The officer demanded, stepping forward. One of his colleagues turned to him, her expression tense. He was acting suspicious near the gates, she said. When we stopped him, he tried to hide this. She held up the USB drive. The officer's eyes narrowed as he examined the man, who was now glaring at them. Something about him felt off, too composed for someone who had just been caught. What's on it? The officer asked, his voice low. We don't know yet, his colleague replied. But whatever it is, he's willing to fight to keep it. The officer's stomach churned. He had a sinking feeling that this incident wasn't random, that it was somehow connected to the man he couldn't stop thinking about. As the restrained man was escorted away, the officer's mind raced. The threads of the story were beginning to intertwine, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The officer watched as the USB drive was taken to a secure room for examination. His pulse quickened as he considered the possibilities. The entire day had been a series of unsettling events, each one pulling him deeper into a mystery he didn't fully understand. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was on that drive could change everything, for better or worse. Meanwhile, the man from earlier had arrived at the heart of the operation, a heavily guarded compound, its exterior unassuming but brimming with hidden security measures. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, every person moving with purpose. Information poured in from global feeds, updates streaming in real time as teams worked to counteract the breach. The man's calm demeanor remained intact, but his focus was sharper than ever. He stood at the head of the command center, overseeing every detail. When a tech specialist approached him with new intel, he leaned in, listening carefully. We've traced the breach, the specialist said, their voice tight with urgency. It originated at the airport. The man's expression didn't change, but a flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. "Do we have the source?" he asked. "Yes," the specialist replied. "An intercepted device that's being analyzed now. But there's more. The individual who smuggled it out wasn't working alone. This was coordinated." The man straightened, his mind racing. The pieces were finally falling into place. He had suspected a larger conspiracy, but this confirmed it. The breach wasn't just an isolated act of espionage, it was part of a calculated effort to dismantle everything they had worked to achieve. At the airport, the officer sat in the secure room, watching over the USB drive as a technician plugged it into an isolated system. He couldn't explain why he had insisted on staying, but something about this felt personal. The technician's face tensed as files began to load, streams of data filling the screen. "This isn't just sensitive," the technician muttered. "It's explosive. These files contain classified operations locations, personnel, everything." The officer's stomach dropped. "Who could have access to something like that?" "Someone with connections," the technician replied, shaking his head. "This isn't small time. Whoever put this together wanted to cause chaos on a global scale." As they spoke, an alert sounded from the terminal. The restrained man had somehow escaped custody, his movements swift and deliberate. The officer bolted from the room, his instincts taking over. He raced through the terminal, scanning the crowd for any sign of the man. When he spotted him near an exit, he didn't hesitate. "Stop!" he shouted, drawing the attention of nearby officers. The man turned, his face set in a defiant glare, but he didn't run. Instead, he raised his hands, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "You have no idea what you've stepped into," the man said as they closed in on him. The officer didn't respond, his focus locked on detaining the suspect. As they cuffed him, the man leaned in slightly, his voice low. "You think this ends here? You're playing checkers while the rest of us play chess." The words chilled the officer, but he pushed them aside. Whatever game this was, he was determined to see it through. Hours later, the man from the compound received a call. The device had been secured, and the smuggler was in custody. But as the team celebrated the recovery of the stolen data, a new report came in. A second breach had been detected, this time from a source even closer to their operation. The man's jaw tightened. "It was a diversion," he said, his voice steady but grim. "They wanted us focused on the airport, while they targeted something bigger." Back at the airport, the officer sat alone, the events of the day weighing heavily on him. He had done his job, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. He thought of the man from earlier, the one he had tried to humiliate, who had carried himself with such quiet confidence. For the first time, the officer wondered if he had misjudged more than just one person. As he stared at his hands, a news alert flashed on his phone. "Global network under attack, authorities scrambled to respond." His breath caught as he read the details, the implications hitting him like a freight train. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was only beginning. The officer sat frozen, the news alert glowing on his phone screen. The world he thought he understood had shifted, revealing cracks that ran deeper than he ever imagined. He had spent years enforcing rules, believing he was on the right side of the line. But now, as the pieces fell into place, he realized the line wasn't as clear as he thought. Back at the compound, the man stood at the center of the chaos. Teams scrambled to counter the second breach, the hum of urgency filling the room. He stayed calm, issuing orders with precision. Each step was calculated, each decision made with the understanding that time was against them. "We've located the secondary breach," someone announced, rushing up to him. "It's a decoy system, but they've managed to infiltrate one of our higher-tier layers." "Shut it down," the man said without hesitation. "And reroute all essential communications through secure lines. We're not giving them anything else." The technician hesitated. "There's a complication. The breach wasn't remote, it was initiated internally. Someone on the inside is working against us. The man's expression hardened. It was the confirmation he didn't want but had anticipated. Turning to another member of his team, he said, "Lock down the building. Nobody leaves until we have answers." The officer, meanwhile, had been called into his supervisor's office. The restrained man from earlier wasn't talking, but his belongings had been sent for analysis. The USB drive was confirmed as critical evidence in the larger global breach, tying the events at the airport to something far more significant. "You're going to need to write up a full report," his supervisor said, her tone sharp. "And be ready for investigators. This is bigger than anything we've dealt with before." The officer nodded, but his thoughts weren't on the paperwork. They were on the mysterious man he had met earlier, the one who seemed to know more than anyone else in the room that day. He had dismissed him, belittled him even, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been standing in the presence of someone far above his pay grade. At the compound, the search for the mole intensified. Files were being cross-referenced, security footage reviewed, and every movement of the team scrutinized. It didn't take long before a suspect emerged, a junior analyst who had been with the organization for less than a year. When confronted, the analyst broke almost immediately. "I didn't have a choice," he stammered, his face pale. "They threatened my family. I didn't know how far it would go." The man listened carefully, his gaze steady. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice calm but unyielding. The analyst hesitated, but the weight of his guilt was clear. "I don't know their names," he admitted. "It's a network. They operate in the shadows, and they're everywhere. They said if I didn't cooperate, they'd ruin my life." The room was silent as the man absorbed this. He didn't condone betrayal, but he understood the power of desperation. "You've put lives at risk," he said finally, his tone measured. "But you can still make this right. Tell us everything you know." The analyst nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief. Over the next hour, he provided critical details enough for the team to dismantle the second breach and trace the network's origins. By the time the man left the compound, the immediate crisis had been contained. But he knew this wasn't the end. The network the analyst had described was vast, and the fight to neutralize it would take time. Still, the day wasn't a loss. Progress had been made, and lives had been spared. As he stepped into the night, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was a briefing on the airport incident, including details about the officer who had tried to interrogate him. The man paused, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The officer's persistence, though misplaced, had inadvertently helped disrupt the network's plans. The officer, meanwhile, sat in the break room, staring at his half-empty coffee. He was exhausted, but a strange sense of clarity had settled over him. The day had been a whirlwind, filled with moments that tested his patience, his beliefs, and his understanding of the world. He thought about the man again, about the quiet dignity with which he had endured the interrogation. The officer had judged him based on appearances, assuming he had the upper hand. But now he realized he had been in the presence of someone extraordinary, someone who moved through the world with purpose and power, not seeking recognition but still commanding respect. The next morning, the officer decided to make a change. He couldn't undo the mistakes he had made, but he could choose to approach his work differently. He resolved to listen more, to question his assumptions, and to treat every person he encountered with the respect they deserved. As for the man, he returned to his work with renewed focus. The events of the past day had strengthened his resolve, reminding him why he did what he did. He didn't seek gratitude or glory. His mission was simple: to protect the world from the dangers most people would never see coming. And though their paths might never cross again, both men carried forward a lesson from their brief encounter. In a world of shadows and secrets, the truth had a way of revealing itself, not always in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments where humanity and understanding shone through.